The smell of burnt coffee reached her before her alarm did. That was the thing about Nora Vance's apartment in those final weeks before the trip. It always smelled like burnt coffee and cedar shavings from the crate she'd been using to sort gear, and underneath both of those things, the faint chemical edge of waterproofing spray she'd applied to her pack 3 times because she kept second-guessing herself about the Patagonia rainy season. 6 months of planning lived in that smell. 3 years of saving lived in it. Every Sunday, she'd skipped brunch, and every birthday dinner, she ducked out of early to put $150 into an account she'd labeled simply Trail. The balance on the morning of October 11th, 3 years and 2 months into her commitment to that account, was $18,340. She had a flight to Buenos Aires in 72 hours. Her pack was in the corner of her bedroom. A 65-liter Gregory Bell Toro in slate gray that she'd researched for 4 months before buying. She'd tested it on day hikes in the Catskills, on a weekend in the Smokies, on a solo overnight at a state park in Pennsylvania, where she'd eaten dehydrated pad thai alone in her tent and thought, "This is the best I've felt in 2 years." The straps were adjusted to her torso length, the hip belt was broken in. The thing fit her the way nothing in her office wardrobe had ever fit her, like it was made specifically for the architecture of her body. Nora was 31 years old, and she worked as a forensic accountant at Callaway and Marsh, a mid-sized financial consulting firm in Midtown Manhattan that specialized in fraud investigation and litigation support. She was good at her job in the way that people are good at things they chose for practical reasons. Methodically, without passion. With a precision that impressed her supervisors and bored her in the marrow. She could read a company's general ledger the way other people read faces. She knew what hiding looked like in numbers. She knew the specific shape of an expense that didn't belong. What she did not know, at 31, was how to protect herself from the people who loved her. Her phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. She let it ring once, twice, reached for it with her eyes still half closed, and saw her mother's name. She answered. "Cassie's water broke early." Her mother's voice was controlled in the particular way that meant she'd already rehearsed the conversation. Linda Vance was the kind of woman who pre-scripted difficult calls the way Nora would pre-scripted difficult client presentations. She's 34 weeks. They're saying the baby is fine, but she needs a hospital, Mom. She needs family, Nora. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Nora counted them. "I leave Thursday," she said. "I know when you leave." A pause. "I'm asking you to think about whether you should." Cassie was Nora's younger sister by 3 years. They had grown up in a beige colonial in Morristown, New Jersey, with a father who worked in insurance and a mother who ran the household like a small corporation she owned outright. Cassie had always been the one their parents worried about in the productive way, the way parents worry about children they can still help. She was impulsive, charming, perpetually underprepared for consequences. She had married a man named Derek Foss at 26 in a garden ceremony that Nora had spent 400 hours helping to coordinate. And they had spent the 2 years following the wedding accruing credit card debt and living in a 2-bedroom rental in Hoboken with aspirational furniture and no savings. The baby was not an accident. Cassie had told Nora she was trying, in a voice that suggested she'd already made the decision and was only informing Nora as a courtesy. Nora had said, "Do you have savings for the first year?" Cassie had said, "You sound like a banker." In her apartment on the morning of October 11th, so holding the phone, Nora looked at her pack in the corner. She thought about saying, "I can come for the birth and leave Thursday as planned." She thought about saying, "Cassie has Derek, she has you, and Dad. She has Derek's mother who has been waiting for this grandchild with the unnerving focus of someone who has no other purpose." She said none of these things. What she said was, "Let me call work." What happened next was not a single decision, but a series of small capitulations that each looked reasonable from the inside. She called work and told them she needed 2 weeks. They were sympathetic. 2 weeks became 6, because Cassie's recovery was harder than expected, and Derek had a project deadline and their mother threw out her back. To 6 weeks became 4 months because the baby, a girl they named Mia, had feeding difficulties, and Cassie had a postpartum anxiety diagnosis that was real and was also, Nora would later recognize, leveraged with extraordinary efficiency. Nora's lease on her apartment ended while she was in Morristown. She put her things in storage. She told herself it was temporary. The $18,340 in the trail account lasted 14 months before she transferred the last of it. She did not go to Patagonia. Eyes, she did not go anywhere. There is a specific quality to the grief of an unlived life. It doesn't announce itself the way ordinary grief does. It doesn't arrive with a clear cause or a defined object. It settles instead like sediment, slowly, invisibly, in layers so thin you don't notice until the accumulation has changed the entire composition of what you are. Nora noticed it in small ways. She noticed it at Mia's first birthday party. Standing in Cassie and Derek's kitchen making 72 mini sandwiches, while Cassie sat in the living room accepting congratulations for motherhood with the serene confidence of someone who has never been told no. She noticed it at Callaway and Marsh, where she'd returned to her position and discovered that 2 of the junior analysts she'd been training before her leave had been promoted to senior examiner while she'd been making sandwiches in Morristown. She noticed it the first time she opened the airline app on her phone and looked at flights to Buenos Aires and immediately, almost reflexively, closed the app. What she did not notice for quite some time was that it was also happening to her money. Nora's grandmother, her father's mother, Eleanor Vance, a woman who had built a small real estate portfolio in the 1970s with the methodical patience of someone who understood compound returns, had died when Nora was 27. The estate had included a cabin in Vermont, on 17 acres outside Stowe, that Eleanor had left specifically to Nora in the will. The language was clear. Nora had read it herself. The cabin and the land it sat on were to pass to Eleanor's granddaughter, Nora Elizabeth Vance. Nora had never moved into the cabin. She'd been in the middle of building her career. The plan was always to figure out the cabin later, after the backpacking trip. But after she'd had the experience, she needed to know what kind of life she wanted. Later became a pressure campaign that lasted 18 months. Her parents' position, delivered at a family dinner that Nora now understood had been specifically orchestrated for this purpose, was that Cassie and Derek needed more space. Their rental was becoming too expensive. The Morristown house was overextended with the baby present all the time. The cabin. Wouldn't it make more sense for Cassie and Derek to live in the cabin for a while until they got on their feet? It wasn't about taking anything from Nora. It was just practical. Nora's father used the word practical 7 times in that dinner. She had counted. She had also, and this was the detail that would later come back to her with the precision of a scalpel, signed a quitclaim deed transferring the cabin to Cassie and Derek Foss for consideration of $1. Her mother had notarized it. The family attorney, who was technically also Cassie and Derek's personal attorney, and whom Nora had not had the presence of mind to recognize as a conflict of interest, had filed it the following morning. Nora had a copy somewhere in a box in her storage unit. She stopped looking for it. She died on a Wednesday in February, 4 years and 3 months after she had canceled her flight to Buenos Aires. It was not dramatic. It was not even surprising in retrospect. It was a snowstorm on Route 9 and a phone call from Cassie asking Nora to pick up Mia from daycare because Derek was in the city and Cassie had a migraine, and Nora had been awake for 19 hours because she'd been working a document-intensive case for Callaway and Marsh, and she'd been living on cold brew and ibuprofen for 3 days, and her hands were not steady on the wheel the way they should have been. The truck came from the left. She had time to feel surprised. That was all. In the specific few seconds before impact, she thought about the trail. Not the accident, not her family, not the 4 years she had spent hollowing herself out for people who received her sacrifice the way a body receives oxygen, automatically, without gratitude, as though it had always been owed. She thought about the cedar shavings on her apartment floor, the smell of waterproofing spray, a photo she'd had taped to her bathroom mirror of the Torres del Paine Massif at sunrise, taken by someone else, which she had looked at every morning for 3 years while she was saving, and which she had taken down the day after she'd called work and asked for those first 2 weeks. She thought, I never even went. And then she did not think anything at all. She woke in her apartment, the smell of burnt coffee, cedar shavings, waterproofing spray. Nora lay flat on her back in the dark and did not move for a very long time. There was a quality to the silence that she recognized before she recognized anything else. The specific silence of a space that belongs only to you, that carries only your sounds, that has not yet been infiltrated by other people's needs. She had not heard that silence in 4 years. She turned her head. The Gregory Bell Toro was in the corner, slate gray, straps adjusted. Her phone was on the nightstand. She picked it up with hands that did not shake, which she noted as though it were data. and looked at the date. October 11th, 72 hours before her flight. Nora sat up slowly. She set the phone face down on the nightstand and sat with her feet on the floor and her hands in her lap and breathed the way she used to breathe at the beginning of a major fraud investigation, the slow, deliberate inhalation of someone who is about to map a system, who needs to see all of it before touching any of it. She was not confused about what had happened. She did not question it or examine it for alternate explanations. She had been a forensic accountant for 7 years. She understood that some facts simply are what they are, regardless of whether they can be explained within a familiar framework, and that the productive response to an inexplicable fact is not to deny it, but to determine what it changes about your position and act accordingly. What it changed was everything. She knew what was coming. She knew the sequence, the phone call at 6:47, her mother's voice, the 2 weeks that became 6 that became 4 months, the savings account, the quitclaim deed, the cabin in Vermont that had belonged to her grandmother and then to her, and then, because of a single document she'd signed while she was exhausted and emotionally pressured and catastrophically naive about the legal implications, to Cassie and Derek Foss. She knew the end of it. The truck on Route 9, February. A snowstorm. She had 4 years of data this time. Nora stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the New York City streetscape below. A delivery truck was double parked. A woman in a yellow coat was walking a large white dog. A man was eating a bagel on the stoop across the street with the concentrated focus of someone who had nowhere to be. She thought, I am going to Patagonia on Thursday. And then, because she was who she was and this was how she operated, she thought, but first, I need to understand the full scope of the damage they caused in the other timeline, because I need to know what I'm preventing and what I'm entitled to recover. She made coffee. Real coffee, not burnt, from the good beans she kept in a ceramic canister on the counter. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and her phone beside her, and she began to make a list. A certified fraud examiner working a case does not begin with what she knows. She begins with what can be proven. This is a discipline that took Nora 3 years of professional practice to internalize fully. In the early days, she'd been impatient, the way young analysts often are. She'd see the shape of a fraud in the first 2 hours and want to move immediately to documentation. Her first supervisor at Callaway and Marsh, a dry, unhurried man named Victor Cheng, who had spent 20 years doing exactly this work, had told her once, "The evidence doesn't care about your intuition. The evidence only cares about itself." She'd thought it was a cliche at the time. She understood it differently now. What could be proven? The trail account, $18,340 on October 11th, had been drawn down by transfers that Nora had authorized, but under conditions she would later be able to characterize as undue influence. She'd transferred $7,000 to Cassie directly, framed as a loan with no written agreement. She'd transferred $4,200 to their parents to cover household expenses related to the baby. She'd spent approximately $4,100 on goods and services for Cassie's household, groceries, baby equipment, medical co-pays, car payments when Derek's check didn't clear. The remaining balance had gone to her own living expenses during the period she wasn't working. Total extractable loss, approximately $15,300. The $7,000 transfer stood absent a written loan agreement but supported by the transfer records, and the circumstances under which it was made would likely be classified as an unenforceable gift rather than a recoverable loan. But that wasn't the most interesting part. The most interesting part was the cabin. Nora pulled up the Vermont property records on her laptop. She knew the parcel number. She'd looked it up once in the other timeline, 2 years after she'd signed the quitclaim deed, when she'd been sitting in her car in Callaway and Marsh's parking garage, having a specific kind of breakdown that presents from the outside like fatigue. She'd looked it up and seen Cassie's name where her grandmother's had been, and then her own, and she'd closed the laptop and gone back to work. The parcel was currently, in this timeline, 3 days before her flight, still in Nora's name. Eleanor Vance had died 2 years ago. The estate had gone through probate. The deed had transferred. The Nora Elizabeth Vance was the recorded owner of a 17.3-acre parcel in Lamoille County, Vermont, with a 2-bedroom cabin assessed at $340,000. In the other timeline, she had signed that away for $1. Under Vermont property law, a quitclaim deed executed under duress or undue influence is voidable. Nora knew this not from Vermont-specific expertise, but from the cases she'd worked. She'd spent 8 months on an elder financial abuse case in 2019 that had involved, among other instruments, a coerced deed transfer executed days before the victim's death. She knew the doctrine, she knew the elements. A vulnerable party, a position of trust exploited, a transaction that no reasonable person would agree to in the absence of that exploitation. She was not certain she met the threshold for a legal challenge to the deed if she'd signed it, but she hadn't signed it yet, and she was not going to. She wrote that at the top of her list in capital letters, "The cabin stays." She kept going. The identity theft piece was more complex and also more alarming. In the other timeline, she'd discovered it by accident 18 months after the deed transfer, when she'd pulled her credit report during a refinancing conversation that had ultimately gone nowhere because her score was 30 points lower than it should have been. There were 2 credit cards on her report that she hadn't opened. A Citi card with a $4,800 balance, a store card with a $1,200 balance. And the addresses associated with both were Derek and Cassie's apartment in Hoboken. She had not reported it. She had called Cassie, and Cassie had cried and said she'd been drowning and she'd only meant to use it temporarily and she would pay it back, and please, please don't call the credit bureau. Please don't tell Mom and Dad. Please don't do this to the baby. Nora had not done anything. Now, sitting at her kitchen table with burnt coffee cooling beside her, she thought about that decision with the detachment of a surgeon examining a procedure she'd watched someone else perform. It had been a catastrophic decision, not because of the $6,000. That was recoverable, because of what it had communicated to Cassie about the consequences of taking from Nora. It had communicated none. In this timeline, those cards had not been opened yet. But she knew Cassie. She knew the sequence. The baby would come early, the financial pressure would mount, and at some point in the next 18 months, Cassie or Derek or both of them together would make a decision about Nora's identity that they would frame to themselves as temporary. Nora could prevent that. More precisely, she could set up the conditions under which preventing it became automatic. A credit freeze, filed today before she left Thursday with all 3 bureaus: Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. A credit freeze meant no new accounts could be opened in her name without her explicit authorization. It cost nothing. It took 20 minutes per bureau. It was absolute. She added it to the list. She thought about the corporate law angle. In the other timeline, she'd been passed over for senior examiner twice while she was taking excessive family leave. The promotions had gone to Marcus Webb and to a woman named Priya Suri, who had been hired 18 months after Nora and who was competent but not, Nora thought, with the clear-eyed lack of sentimentality that Rebirth enables, more qualified. She had grounds for a discrimination claim based on the FMLA, the Family and Medical Leave Act, which protects employees who take qualifying leave from adverse employment consequences, including denial of promotion. She had not known this clearly enough. Wait, in the other timeline, to pursue it. She knew it now. But that was a weapon she'd only need if the same patterns emerged in this timeline. The goal, she understood, was to not be present for those patterns to emerge. She was going to Patagonia on Thursday. She was going to be on that trail. She was going to meet whatever life was waiting for her there instead of the one she'd been handed in Morristown. The revenge, and she did not flinch from that word, because she'd been a fraud examiner for 7 years and she knew what to call things, was not the point. The revenge was the perimeter. It was the legal and financial architecture she was going to build around herself before she left, so that when her phone rang at 6:47 on the morning of October 11th, her life would not be vulnerable to what came next. At 6:41, she got up and made more coffee, real coffee, from the good beans. At 6:47, her phone rang. She looked at her mother's name on the screen. She let it ring 4 times. She answered. "Cassie's water broke early," her mother said. "I know," Nora said, which was true. A pause. "You know?" "I mean, I hear you. Is she at the hospital?" "Yes, they're saying the baby is fine, but..." "Good. I'm glad she's fine. I'll call the hospital and check in when I'm at work. Mom, I need to tell you something before you continue." The silence on the other end had a specific texture. She could feel her mother recalibrating. I'm not canceling my trip, Nora said. I leave Thursday. I've been planning this for 3 years. I've given notice at my apartment. I've already spoken to Calloway about a leave of absence. None of that changes because Cassie went into labor 6 weeks early. Cassie has Derek, she has you and Dad, she has Derek's mother, she has an OB and a hospital and a NICU if the baby needs it. I am not a medical professional and I am not going to be more useful than any of those people. She said all of this in the tone she used on hostile witnesses in deposition prep. Not aggressive, not defensive, factual. Her mother said, Nora, I mean it, Mom. She is your sister. Yes, and I'll be a better sister to her from Patagonia than I've been to myself for the past 3 years. While I've been saving for this trip, I'm going. Your grandmother's cabin is mine, Nora said. I know you're going to bring that up at some point, so I want to address it now. The cabin that Grandma Eleanor left me is mine. I am not signing anything that transfers it. I will not be asked to sign anything that transfers it. If there's a family conversation about the cabin that I'm not present for, I want you to know in advance that any document produced by that conversation has no legal effect without my signature on it. And I am not going to sign. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. I don't know what's gotten into you, her mother said finally. Travel, Nora said. I've been told it's broadening. I'll call and check on Cassie this afternoon. Give her my love. She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Her heartbeat was elevated, but not dramatically so. She noted this the way she noted everything. As data. Then she opened her laptop and began filing the credit freezes. The thing about a credit freeze is that it takes longer than 20 minutes per bureau. It took her 45 minutes with Equifax alone because their verification system had a specific UX problem she'd encountered before, a loop between the identity confirmation screen and the address verification screen that only resolved if you cleared your browser cache mid-process. She cleared it. She completed the freeze. She moved to Experian, then TransUnion. By noon, she had all 3 locked. She pulled her own credit report while she was at it. She reviewed it with the focused attention of someone who does this professionally and found nothing anomalous. Everything was clean. The cards Cassie would open in the other timeline did not exist yet. They would not exist in this one. She called her storage unit. She'd been paying for it for 8 months, ever since she'd let her lease go. Or rather, in this timeline, she'd been planning to let her lease go. Only she now had no intention of doing that. She called and extended her rental agreement for 12 months as a buffer, and then called her landlord and told him she was staying. He seemed mildly inconvenienced, and then agreed. She packed the last of her gear in the afternoon. She'd been mostly packed for a week, but there were small things. The first aid kit she kept second-guessing, the backup water filter, the journal she'd bought, and then not been sure about because carrying a physical journal was a weight commitment. She put the journal in, she'd earned the weight. She called Calloway and Marsh and spoke to Victor Ching, who was still her supervisor in this timeline, and who received her request for an 8-month leave of absence with the same dry, unhurried quality he brought to everything. The Hargrove case closes end of the month, he said. You're free after that. I know, she said. I'll finish my work on Hargrove remotely, file everything by the 30th, and I'll be on a plane the 31st. 8 months is a long time. I know. You're not quitting. No. All right. A pause. She heard him turning pages. Check in if you find anything interesting in the mountains. I've always wanted to go. You should, she said. It's supposed to be extraordinary. She spent the evening in a restaurant she liked near her apartment, a small Vietnamese place with plastic stools and a menu written in marker on a chalkboard, and a faux broth that tasted like someone had spent 2 days on it, which she suspected was true. She ate alone and did not look at her phone. The restaurant was half full. 2 people were on a date in the corner that seemed to be going reasonably well. A man was eating by himself at the counter with a paperback propped against the napkin dispenser. She thought about Mia. This was the one part of the calculation that did not resolve cleanly. Mia, her niece, in the other timeline, had been born early and then been perfectly healthy and had grown into a 4-year-old who called Nora no-no, and who had, Nora acknowledged with a specificity of pain she hadn't expected to feel. A particular way of tucking herself under Nora's arm when she was tired that had been one of the few genuinely good things about the last 4 years. In this timeline, Mia would be born early and be perfectly healthy without Nora present for any of it. Cassie would raise her without Nora as the unpaid third parent. Nora sat with this for the length of time it took her to finish her foe. She thought, Mia will be fine. Cassie is impulsive and financially reckless and has a history of taking from Nora without understanding that she's doing it, but she loves her daughter. Derek is passive and conflict avoidant, but he's not cruel. Mia will be fine, she thought, and I will be fine. She paid the check. She walked home in the October dark with the city noise around her and the smell of the restaurant on her coat, and she felt not happy exactly, but positioned. The way she felt at the beginning of a case when she understood the terrain well enough to move through it. She was going to Patagonia on Thursday, and before she went, there was one more thing she needed to do. The offices of Whitmore and Lau were on the 41st floor of a building on 6th Avenue that had the specific corporate blandness of a place designed to communicate reliability without warmth. Nora had made the appointment 2 days ago, after her phone call with her mother, and she had prepared for it with the same methodical attention she gave deposition prep. She was meeting with Rebecca Lau, an estate attorney who had been recommended to Nora 3 years ago by a colleague, and whom Nora had never called because she'd never felt urgency about the cabin. She felt urgency now. "The property is in your name," Rebecca said, reviewing the document Nora had brought, a certified copy of the deed that she'd ordered from the Vermont Land Records office the morning after she'd woken up. "Clean title, no encumbrances. What's your concern?" "Family pressure," Nora said. "I want to protect it against a scenario in which I'm pressured to transfer it while I'm traveling." Rebecca looked at her with the specific neutrality of a professional hearing something she's heard before in different forms. You want to prevent a coerced transfer." "I want to make a coerced transfer impossible." "That's different from preventing one." "I know. What are my options?" Rebecca had 3. The first was a trust. She could transfer the property into a revocable living trust, naming herself as both grantor and trustee, with a successor trustee who was not a family member. The trust would mean that any transfer of the property would require her explicit action as trustee, not merely her signature on a deed. The second was a right of first refusal recorded on the title, which would create a procedural hurdle but not an absolute barrier. The third was an irrevocable trust with a spendthrift provision, which would be absolute. The property would be permanently protected against her own impulse to transfer it under pressure, but also permanent. "I want the revocable living trust," Nora said, "with a successor trustee who is not related to me." Can you recommend someone?" "We have several attorneys in the firm who serve as professional trustees." "That works. We can draft this in a week." "I leave the country in 48 hours," Nora said. "Can you have it in 24? Rebecca looked at her for a moment. "Rush fee?" she said. "Fine." The trust was executed the following afternoon. The cabin at 17.3 acres in Lamoille County, Vermont, assessed at $340,000, passed into the Nora Elizabeth Vance Revocable Living Trust. Nora was the trustee. An attorney named Bernard Whitmore, Rebecca's partner, a methodical man in his 60s who seemed to regard all property transactions with the same mild satisfaction, was named successor trustee. The trust document included a specific provision she'd asked Rebecca to draft. Any transfer of trust property required the signature of both the trustee and a licensed Vermont attorney, independent of the trust administration, as a second check. Rebecca had raised an eyebrow at this. "Belt and suspenders," Nora had said. Indeed. She'd paid the rush fee without blinking. It was money well spent. She understood value now in a way she hadn't understood it in the other timeline. Not the value of money itself, but the value of the structures that money could build, the legal architecture that made a space safe. She'd spent 4 years of the other timeline with no architecture at all. So operating in good faith within a family system that was not operating in good faith, and the cost had been everything. She flew to Buenos Aires on October 14th. The Buenos Aires airport smelled like industrial cleaner and cigarette smoke from the designated smoking area near the International Arrivals Hall, and under those things, the specific warmth of a southern hemisphere spring that came through the automatic doors every time someone walked out, lighter and drier than a New York October, with a quality of sunlight that seemed to come from a different angle entirely. Nora stood at the luggage carousel with the Gregory Beltoro at her feet and felt, for the first time in what she experienced as 4 years, but what the calendar said was 3 months of savings and planning, that she was somewhere. She took a bus to the hostel. She'd booked a private room, which cost more, but which she'd decided on, because she wanted a door she could close when she needed to process the particular cognitive dissonance of being dead and also being 31 and also standing at the beginning of the trip she dreamed about for 3 years. She ate a late dinner at a Parilla 3 blocks from the hostel, beef ribs with chimichurri and a glass of Malbec, and wrote in the journal she'd almost not brought. She wrote, "I am here. The cabin is in a trust. The credit is frozen. The family knows where I stand. I am here." She ordered another glass of wine and looked at the people around her. A couple arguing quietly in Italian, their hands moving more than their voices. A group of young men who appeared to be celebrating something. A woman eating alone at the bar with the composed self-sufficiency of someone who has been doing this for a long time and finds it genuinely preferable to eating with company. Nora looked at the woman and thought, "That's what I'm going to look like in 6 months." She was not wrong. She spent 3 weeks in Buenos Aires because she wanted to, because the city had a quality she hadn't expected. A kind of grandeur in active decay, Art Nouveau buildings with their plasterwork going soft at the corners, wide avenues that seemed to have been built for a population larger than the one they now served. She took Spanish lessons with a woman named Valentina who taught in her apartment near Palermo, and who had the teaching philosophy of someone who believes language is acquired through humiliation and laughter in roughly equal measure. She learned to negotiate in Spanish. Not perfectly. Well enough. She flew to Mendoza and spent a week in the wine country, which was drier and colder than she'd expected, and which had a quality of light in the late afternoon that she found herself unable to stop photographing. She hiked into the Andes foothills on a day trip and felt the altitude in her chest and the rock under her boots and the specific pleasure of physical effort that serves no purpose except itself. She flew to Puerto Montt and took the ferry system south through the Chilean fjords. 4 days of slow water passage with forested mountains on both sides and dolphins in the wake and a quality of weather that changed 3 times a day. She read. She wrote in the journal. She talked to the other passengers when she wanted to and didn't when she didn't. She arrived in Puerto Natales on a Tuesday in November with the Gregory Baltoro settled on her back like an agreement she'd finally kept with herself. Patagonia in November was wind and light and a quality of scale that made everything she'd previously thought of as large seem parochial. The towers of the Paine Massif were not dramatic in the way photographs suggested. They were instead simply there. Insistently present, geometric, and uncompromising, rising from the surrounding steppe with the matter-of-fact authority of things that have been in their place for millions of years and are not interested in your response to them. She registered for the W circuit at the park administration office and paid for her site permits. She bought fuel for her camp stove at the gear shop in town. She ate one final meal at a restaurant in Puerto Natales, king crab, which was the local specialty, served in a way that was simultaneously fancy and completely unfussy, and she went to bed early in preparation for an early start. She was on the trail at 6:40 in the morning. The Mirador Las Torres, the viewpoint at the base of the 3 granite towers that give the park its name, was a 5-hour round trip from the trail starting point, uphill through Langa Beach Forest and glacial moraine. Nora climbed it on her 2nd day in the park, starting before dawn, carrying a thermos of coffee and nothing else because she'd left her pack at the site. The forest in the pre-dawn dark was a study in texture. The Langa Beach have bark like crumpled paper, a silver gray in the dim light, and their canopy in November was turning autumn in the southern hemisphere, meaning the leaves were going copper and rust. Her boots crunched on the frost. Her breath made small clouds. The coffee in the thermos was gas station quality, from the camp kitchen at the lodge near her site, and she drank it anyway with the gratitude of someone who has been cold long enough to renegotiate her standards. She reached the lake at the base of the towers at sunrise. The light came in from the east and hit the granite faces directly, turning them amber and then gold, and then a shade she didn't have a precise word for. Not orange, not pink, something between those colors that existed only in this specific atmospheric condition at this specific altitude at this specific time of morning. The lake was glacial turquoise, utterly still in the hour before the wind began, and it reflected the towers perfectly. She stood at the edge of the water for a long time. She thought about Eleanor Vance, her grandmother, who had bought her first piece of property in 1974 with savings from 12 years of waitressing, and who had told Nora, when Nora was 9 years old, that the most important thing a woman could own was something that couldn't be taken from her without her explicit agreement. She'd been talking about real estate. She'd been talking about autonomy. She thought about what she'd built in the 48 hours before she got on the plane. The trust. The credit freezes. The conversation with her mother, the small, precise, legally defensible architecture of a life that belonged to herself. She thought about the truck on Route 9. She took a photograph of the towers. She turned around and started back down the trail. That was when she nearly collided with a man who was coming up the trail carrying a camera and looking at it instead of the path in front of him. See, he was taller than her by several inches and broader in the shoulders than most hikers she'd passed, which she noticed in the half-second before impact and which registered as data, even as she stepped sideways and he stepped the same direction, and they performed the small, awkward dance of two people trying to pass each other on a narrow trail section with a steep drop on one side. Lo siento, he said automatically without looking up. Está bien, she said. So, which was now one of the 30 phrases she had down solid. He looked up. He had the slightly dazed quality of someone who has been looking at something beautiful through a lens for long enough that real-world obstacles have temporarily stopped registering. His camera was a Sony mirrorless, a serious piece of equipment, not a tourist camera, and he was wearing the kind of gear that suggested he'd been on trails before. Worn boots, a jacket that had seen weather, a day pack with a hydration tube. He was perhaps 35, with dark eyes and the slightly windburned complexion of someone who has been outdoors for several days. Sorry, he said, switching to English after clocking something about her. I was looking at the light. The light's worth looking at, she said. You're coming down from the Mirador? Yes, go early. The lake is still when the sun comes up. She stepped around him on the uphill side. How early did you leave? She glanced back at him. 5:45. He looked at his watch. It was 7:23. I'm late. A little. It'll still be good. She kept walking. Has the wind started yet? At the top? She stopped. Not when I left. Give it another hour, maybe 2. He nodded. He was looking at her in the way of someone filing information efficiently, not appraising, assessing. She had the distinct sense that he was someone who registered things accurately, which was an uncommon quality and one she found she noticed. First time in the park? He asked. Second day. You're doing the W? Full circuit, he raised an eyebrow. Ambitious. Efficient, she said. He almost smiled. Are you going to do the Glacier Gray approach on the north side or through the valley? North side. I want to come in from above. The footing's tricky in the scree section. You want to stay left of the cairns when you get to the exposed ridge. The right side looks more direct, but it's loose. Good to know. She looked at him for a moment. You've done it before. 3 times. This section specifically. He held up the camera slightly. I'm working on a project. She filed this. What kind of project? Documentary, light in extreme environments. He said it without pretension, said as though it were a straightforward description of a job rather than an aesthetic manifesto. She appreciated this. How long are you here? 2 more weeks. You? 8 days on the circuit, then I'm moving north. He nodded. Good luck with the circuit. He turned back toward the trail upward. Stay left of the cairns, she said. He paused without turning. In the scree section on the north approach. I know. A beat. I was talking to you about it. I know, she said. I meant in general. He did turn then, and the almost smile was more definite. I'm Marco, he said. Nora. Safe hiking, Nora. Same. She continued down. She thought about the conversation twice in the next 2 hours. Once, immediately afterward, at a section of trail where the forest gave way to open steppe, and she had a clear view of the lake below and the mountains above and the particular quality of Patagonian light that seemed to come from everywhere at once, rather than a single source. She thought, he knew the trail, he had an eye for light, he was working on something. The second time was at the lodge near her site, drinking the gas station coffee and looking at the map of the circuit pinned to the wall. No, she thought, north approach, left of the cairns, Glacier Gray section, good information, free. She had no particular feeling about Marco beyond this. That was not entirely true. She had the specific mild interest she felt at the beginning of anything, with the potential to be useful or interesting, which was the same feeling she had at the start of a complex case. Not excitement, not attraction in the conventional soap opera sense. Something more like, this could be something worth paying attention to. She had learned to trust that feeling. She did not see him again for 3 days. The circuit continued. Valley del Francis on the 3rd day. A full-day hike into the hanging glacier valley that required crossing a suspension bridge over a glacial river and then climbing through forest into alpine terrain where the terrain opened suddenly, like a door, onto a high cirque surrounded on 3 sides by glaciers and granite walls from which ice falls dropped occasionally, silently, and then arrived as sound a second after they arrived as sight. She stood in the cirque for 45 minutes and felt the profound specific irrelevance of every problem she had ever had that was not related to altitude. Her phone had intermittent service. She checked it twice a day at the lodge if there was signal. Not because she was expecting anything, but because she had established before she left a specific system. The system was this. She had retained a law firm. Not Whitmore and Lau, but a different firm, a litigation boutique recommended by a colleague to monitor her credit and the title records for the Vermont property and to contact her if anything anomalous occurred. She'd set up a secure email through which they'd communicate. She checked it daily. Nothing anomalous had occurred. She'd had 3 text messages from her mother in the first week, each escalating slightly in tone. She'd replied once, briefly, "Baby and Cassie are healthy. Glad to hear it. I'm well." She had not called. She'd had 2 messages from Cassie herself. The first was a photograph of Mia, newborn, eyes still unfocused, wrapped in a white hospital blanket, unmistakably healthy. The second was a text. "I need to talk to you about the cabin." Nora had replied, "The cabin is in a trust. My estate attorney manages it. If you have questions, you can have your attorney contact Rebecca Lau at Whitmore and Lau. Here is her email." There had been no further messages about the cabin. On the 4th day of the circuit, she reached the Glacier Gray section and approached from the north as she'd planned. The scree section was as advertised, loose, angled, requiring precise foot placement and the willingness to move slowly when moving slowly was correct. She stayed left of the cairns. The footing was solid. She came over the ridge and saw the glacier from above. Glaciers from above look different than glaciers from the side. From the side, they are blue-white walls of compressed ice with a quality of ancient weight. From above, on a clear afternoon with thin cloud cover and the wind at her back, the gray glacier was a slow river of fractured light, crevasses catching shadow, seracs glowing almost translucent, the meltwater channels on the surface running blue as antifreeze. She could see the calving face from where she stood, where house-sized blocks had broken off into the lake below over the past centuries. She took 12 photographs and knew at least 2 of them were genuinely good. She was setting up her camp stove at the designated site near the glacier when she heard boots on the trail and looked up to see Marco coming down the north ridge with his Sony mirrorless and an expression of concentrated alertness that was, she noted, exactly what she'd expected. He saw her tent. He saw her. "Left of the cairns," he said. "Solid footing?" She agreed. He set his pack down on the adjacent flat rock, which was the next designated site, with the ease of someone who has done this enough times that camp setup has become automatic. He had efficient hands, she noticed, not rushed, just efficient. "You're 2 days ahead of the average pace for the circuit," he said. "I've been covering ground." "Why?" She looked up from the camp stove. It was a reasonable question. Most people doing the full circuit slowed down in the middle sections to absorb the terrain. "I want to see it all. I've been waiting a long time." "How long?" 3 years of planning. Longer, in a way. She lit the stove. The small blue flame appeared and held. "What are you shooting today?" He sat on his pack. He had the camera on his knee. "I was looking for the light on the calving face in the afternoon. The angle changes completely between 2 and 4. It starts lateral and becomes backlit. The ice looks different in backlit conditions, more transparent. Can you photograph the calving directly, with enough speed? If you're lucky and patient, you need a shutter speed of at least 2,000 to freeze the initial fall. The splash is slower. What's harder is the sound. The crack happens before the visual movement. Wait, because you're often far enough away that you're seeing in real time, but hearing delayed. He paused. There's a 1 to 2 second lag between the crack and the visual on the face at this distance. Light travels faster than sound, she said. At altitude, yes. She was making pasta from a dehydrated packet, not because it was good, but because it was efficient. She'd eaten enough good food in Buenos Aires and Mendoza and Puerto Natales to have a bank of sensory satisfaction to draw on. On the trail, she ate for fuel and saved the experience of food for towns. Do you want pasta? She said. It's bad, but it's calories. He looked at her for a moment. I have my own. You can still have pasta? He set up his camp stove beside hers. What kind? Pesto? From a powder? From a powder, he repeated. Don't make that face. You said you've been out here for 2 weeks. Your standards are lower than you think. He made the pasta. They ate side by side on the flat rock overlooking the glacier with the wind coming from the south and the light on the ice doing exactly what he'd described, shifting from lateral to something more angled, more penetrating, making the ice look less solid. A piece of the calving face dropped while they were eating, a tower of ice perhaps 20 meters tall that fell slowly, and then hit the lake surface in a white burst. And the crack reached them a full 2 seconds after they saw it happen. 1,940 milliseconds, Marco said without looking up from his pasta. She looked at him. From when I saw the first movement to when I heard the crack, he said. I count automatically. How long have you been counting time delays? Since I was about 12. My father was a sound engineer. He had a thing about the gap between event and perception. A pause. I thought it was going to be annoying when I was a kid. It became useful. Things often do, she said. The glacier cracked again, somewhere in the depths of the ice, a sound like furniture being moved in the room above you. The light continued to change. Marco's camera was out, and he was working. Not intrusively, not performatively, but with the same efficient calm he brought to everything else. She washed the pasta pot in the meltwater stream. She made tea. She sat back on the rock with the mug and the journal, and she wrote, Day 4, the glacier and backlit conditions. A person named Marco who counts time delays. The towers are behind me now, and the ice is in front of me, and everything in my life that I've tried to be responsible about, at the expense of what I'm actually supposed to be doing, can wait until I come home. She wrote, The cabin is safe. The credit is frozen. The trust is filed. She wrote, I am here. Over the next 8 days, they covered the remaining sections of the circuit with the irregular synchrony of 2 people hiking at the same pace who have not discussed hiking together. She was not in the habit of assigning meaning to coincidences, and she did not assign meaning to the coincidence of their pace. She noted it. She let it be what it was. They talked in the evenings, not continuously. There were evenings she spent alone and evenings he spent working on his footage. And this was not awkward. It was simply what 2 independent people did when they happened to be in the same place. What she learned in the evenings that were conversation. His name was Marco Reyes. He was 34. He had grown up in Mexico City in a family that had the specific organized chaos of large families with strong personalities, and he had left at 22 for graduate school in documentary film at NYU and had never moved back. Which he described without guilt or excessive nostalgia. He was based in Brooklyn, as was she, though in different neighborhoods, and he worked primarily in long-form documentary with a focus on environments in flux. He had covered droughts, wildfires, flooding, and the specific human ecosystems that formed around resource scarcity. He was not romantic about any of it. He found it interesting. He asked about her work on the 3rd evening they talked. She told him the honest version. Forensic accounting, fraud investigation, the specific professional pleasure of following money through a system until it revealed where it had gone and who had benefited. You read ledgers the way I read light, he said. She considered this. There's probably a version of that that's profound and a version that's just accurate. Both can be true at once. What do you see when you look at a ledger? Data? Pattern. The absence, the places where a pattern should continue and doesn't. That's exactly it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. They were at a section of the trail with a permitted fire ring, the first of the circuit. That's what I look for in environments. The absence. A forest that should have particular species and doesn't. A glacier that should be advancing and is retreating. The negative space in a system. Pattern recognition? She said. And the willingness to look at what you find. She thought about the credit card accounts she'd found on her report in the other timeline, the signature she'd given on the quitclaim deed, the patterns she had not been willing to look at when she'd found them. That's harder than it sounds, she said. It always is. The fire crackled. The sky above the southern hemisphere was an arrangement of stars she was not completely familiar with. The same stars, so that in a configuration that had been subtly reorganized from where she usually saw them. The Southern Cross was visible. She'd read about it, but the reading hadn't prepared her for how differently oriented the sky felt. "Why did you wait 3 years to come?" Marco asked. She looked at the fire. "I got delayed." "By what?" "Family obligations that I should have managed differently." "But you're here now." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't take a trip I wanted to take when I was 25 because of something similar. A family situation I thought was my responsibility to solve. I was wrong about that." "Did you go eventually?" "Yes. A year later, I went and it changed. Not everything, but the specific thing it needed to change." He looked at her. "You strike me as someone who knows what she came here to change." "I know what I came here to confirm," she said. He waited. "That I was right to come," she said. "That the cost was worth paying." "Is it?" She looked at the Southern Cross. The glacier in backlit conditions, the crack and the 2-second lag and the white explosion of ice into water, the pesto pasta from a powder and the gas station coffee, and the frost on the Lenga beach bark and the specific color of the towers at sunrise that she'd never had a word for. "Every day," she said. She left the park on a Saturday, 10 days after she'd entered. Oh, with the Gregory Beltoro worn to a new softness around the edges of the hip belt, where the fabric had been broken in completely. She took a bus back to Puerto Natales and spent 2 days there. Laundry, a long meal, a full night's sleep in a bed, before she went north. Marco left the same day. They had exchanged numbers at the trailhead, which had felt practical rather than significant, though she was aware that the line between practical and significant often only became clear in retrospect. "Oh," he said, "I'm going to Atacama next week, if you end up there." She said, "I'm going to Bolivia first, maybe after." He said, "Let me know." She said, "I will." They went their separate directions. She did not think about Marco with the distracted, low-grade, obsessive quality that she associated with conventional romantic interest. She thought about him the way she thought about a complex case she'd set aside for the moment, with interest that had been deliberately parked, to be returned to at the appropriate time. She was aware that this was not how people typically described attraction. She had never been typical in this specific way. Bolivia was 3 weeks. La Paz, the Salt Flats, a road trip to the Red Lagoon in the southwest, where flamingos stood in sulfurous water and the altitude was over 14,000 feet, and her lungs had to renegotiate their entire operating model. She drank coca tea and ate a lot of quinoa and spent a day on a tour bus with a retired couple from Osaka and a young woman from Berlin named Greta, who was traveling for the second time after a divorce, and who had the particular quality of determined cheerfulness that Nora recognized as something that would, in another 6 months, become genuine. She checked her law firm's secure email every few days. On a Tuesday in her second week in Bolivia, there was a message. The subject line was, "Vermont property. Attempted title action." She sat in the small internet cafe in Uyuni where she'd come for signal and read it carefully. The message was from the associate at the litigation boutique, a young woman named Ashley Park, who had the communication style of someone trained to lead with the facts and save the interpretation for later. The substance of it was this. Someone, identifying themselves as Derek and Cassie Foss, I had contacted the Lamoille County Clerk's office in Vermont and requested information about the title to the cabin property. They had also separately contacted an attorney in Stowe and asked whether the quitclaim deed they'd been given could be enforced or re-executed. The Stowe attorney, apparently a scrupulous person, had reviewed the land records and found the property in trust, confirmed the trust filing, and told the Fosses that there was no quitclaim deed on record, and the property was in a trust that he could not advise them about since he didn't represent the trust. The Fosses had not taken further legal action. Yet, Ashley Park's message concluded, "No immediate action required. The trust is performing its designed function. I wanted you to be aware." Nora sat in the internet cafe in Uyuni with the altitude headache she'd had since arriving and read the message 3 times. She thought about Cassie calling the Vermont clerk's office. She thought about Derek, passive, conflict-avoidant Derek, calling a Stowe attorney to ask whether he could enforce a document that didn't exist. She thought about 4 years of the other timeline in which she had been the person who did not protect herself, who gave everything when asked and more when not asked, who signed a deed for $1 because her mother was in the room and she was tired, and the word practical had been used so many times it had temporarily replaced her capacity for analysis. She thought, "I built the architecture correctly." She wrote back to Ashley Park, "Thank you. Please note in the file that I'm aware of the attempt. If any further action is taken, I'd like to be notified within 24 hours. No further action required from me at this time." She closed the email. She ordered another Coca tea. She had a bus to catch. She texted Marco from the Salt Flats because the particular absurdity of where she was standing seemed like something worth sharing with someone who understood how light worked. The message was, "Salt Flats at noon. The reflections on the water layer look like you're standing on the sky. Can you freeze that with a 2,000 shutter speed, or is it too diffuse?" He replied 20 minutes later, "Too diffuse unless there's a hard edge. Oh, what's on the horizon?" She took a photograph and sent it. The volcanic peak to the east, sharp against the blue. He replied, "Perfect anchor. Set the exposure for the sky, not the flats. The foreground will blow out slightly, but the reflection reads as solid." She adjusted her phone camera settings and took the photograph. It was the best thing she'd ever taken. She sent it to him. He replied, "Yes, just that." One word. She appreciated the economy of it. She was in the Atacama 14 days later. Marco was in the Atacama. This did not feel like a coincidence, because neither of them was a person who arranged coincidences, and both of them were people who had planned to end up in the Atacama at approximately this time, and the overlap was simply a fact about 2 independent itineraries that happened to share a geographic intersection. She did not assign it meaning in the romantic comedy sense. She noted it. He was staying at the same hostel by a different route entirely. He'd driven up from San Pedro after a shoot further south. She'd come by bus from Bolivia. They had dinner the first evening in the hostel's courtyard, where the altitude cooled to near freezing after sunset, and the stars above the Atacama were the most improbable arrangement she'd ever seen, a density of light that made the concept of background obsolete because there was no background, only more foreground. Well, stars stacked behind stars. "The salt flat photograph," he said. "Yes?" "The anchor worked. The volcanic peak." "You told me." "I wanted to see it." "Can I?" He held out his hand, not for her phone, but with the kind of gesture that was asking, that had space for no in it. She passed him the phone. He looked at the photograph for a long time. "This is very good," he said. "Not compositionally. Technically, it's imperfect. But you saw it. That's harder to teach." She took the phone back. I've been looking at things differently lately." "Since when?" "Since I stopped letting other things claim my attention." She looked at the stars. The Milky Way in the Atacama was not the faint smear she'd seen from rural Pennsylvania. It was structural, a band of compacted light with depth to it, a 3-dimensional object rendered in 2 dimensions. "I spent a long time letting people need things from me. Not all of it was their doing. Some of it was mine." "The family situation you mentioned?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The courtyard had a few other people, all quiet, all looking at the same sky. "Are you through with it?" "The situation? She paused, choosing the word. "Restructured it. The conditions that made it possible to take from me don't exist anymore." "Legal structures?" She looked at him. "How did you know?" "You're a forensic accountant. You solve problems with documents." She thought about this. "Oh, yes, credit freezes, a property trust, a law firm on retainer monitoring my assets." She said it plainly, without embarrassment. She'd stopped being embarrassed by precaution. "My younger sister had a history of using my resources without full disclosure. I used the tools I had to make it structurally impossible to continue." He nodded slowly, not in a way that suggested judgment. in a way that suggested he was filing the information accurately. "That's very practical," she said. A slight pause. "I was going to say precise." She looked at him in the specific way she looked at things she was recalibrating her assessment of. "What's the project?" she asked. "The full scope of it. You've mentioned it, but not in detail." He leaned back in his chair, which was one of the hostel's plastic garden chairs, the kind that are never comfortable and always present. "It's a long-form documentary project about what I'm calling environmental lag, the gap between when a system changes and when the change becomes visible. In glaciers, it's ice loss that happened decades ago becoming visible as current retreat. In deserts, it's the edge of the Atacama advancing into what used to be arable land, invisibly until a farmer wakes up one morning and his soil doesn't hold water the way it did. In forests, it's tree death that starts in the root system years before the canopy shows it." "The negative space," she said. "What should be there and isn't? Yes. And the light aspect? Light reveals lag," he said, "if you know how to read it. The glacier in backlit conditions looks transparent because backlight doesn't illuminate the surface, it passes through. And what you see is the internal structure, the cracks and air pockets and density variations that mark the stress events. The history of the ice." She was quiet. "Why did you become a fraud examiner?" he asked. She thought about it. She'd given the conventional answer many times. Practical career, good at numbers, interesting problems. None of that was false. "My grandmother," she said. "She built something over 50 years through patience and precise documentation. She knew where every dollar was. She never let anyone convince her that she'd imagined the numbers. When she left me her property, so she was leaving me the philosophy, not just the asset." She paused. "I understand it better now than I did when she was alive. What do you understand about it now?" "That documentation is a form of care," she said, "for your past self. You document correctly so that your future self has something to stand on." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, the way he'd said it about the photograph. The stars did not move. Nothing moved except the very cold wind coming down from the Andes, which arrived at the courtyard with the clean authority of something that had traveled a very long distance undisturbed. She stayed in the Atacama for 11 days. She stayed 9 of them with Marco. What happened between them was not sudden. It was the kind of thing that happens between two people who are moving at the same pace and have been paying attention to the same kinds of things for long enough that their frames of reference have begun to overlap at the edges. It was not a movie scene. It was 11 days of shared meals and shared desert walks and shared evenings under the most improbable sky she'd ever been under. And at some point, she couldn't have said which day, which hour, the distinction between two independent people who happen to be in the same place and two people who are in this together stopped being clear. He kissed her first, which she noted in the way she noted things as a piece of information about his character. He was not the kind of person who waited to be given explicit permission for everything. He was also not the kind of person who acted without reading the room correctly. He read the room. He had excellent light-reading skills. She did not pull back. She did not perform the conventional female retreat of ambivalence about wanting something she wanted. She'd spent 4 years in the other timeline retreating from what she wanted. She was done with retreat. She said, "I'm going to Peru in 2 weeks." He said, "I know." She said, "I don't want to negotiate this as if it's a transaction." He said, "I understand that." She said, "I also don't want to pretend it isn't what it is." He said, "What is it?" She looked at him. The Atacama night was cold and enormous around them, the kind of night that makes all human concerns feel appropriately scaled, neither insignificant nor inflated, just the right size. "Something worth paying attention to?" she said. He said, "Yes, she went to Peru. She spent 3 weeks in the Sacred Valley, walking Inca trails above the cloud line, eating ceviche in Cusco at restaurants that had been there since before she was born, sitting in the ruins of Pizek at late afternoon with the valley below her in gold light and the mountains above her in the last of the snow. She was not, during those 3 weeks, thinking about Cassie or Derek or the Vermont cabin or the credit freezes or the truck on Route 9. She was thinking about Peru. She was thinking about the specific quality of altitude above 3,000 meters, which does something to the quality of thought, slows it down, makes it more deliberate, strips away the efficiency she normally prized, and replaced it with a kind of patience she hadn't known she had. She was also, with some frequency, thinking about Marco. She'd been right about what it was. It was something worth paying attention to. Marco messaged her from Bolivia. He'd gone south again to Potosi for something related to the mining sections of his project. He sent her photographs with minimal captions: mine entrance, morning, 4,200 m sulfur plume, Uyuni, noon. A miner's face in direct sun, 3/4 angle, eyes closed. She sent back, the sacred valley at golden hour, exposure on the clouds, not the ruins. He replied, the ruins read as negative space this way. She replied, that was the point. In Cusco, she found a good internet cafe with fast signal and spent an afternoon dealing with the financial architecture she'd left running in her absence. Ashley Park's email update: no further activity from the Fosses on the Vermont property. The credit freeze remained intact. She checked the summary reports from all 3 bureaus. Her credit score, now that no one was opening fraudulent accounts in her name, had continued its upward drift. She'd been making steady automatic payments on her student loans from an account she'd set up to run without her attention. She'd asked Ashley Park before she left to do one additional thing, to research whether any of the transfers she'd made to Cassie in the year before her departure, the $7,000 labeled as a loan with no written agreement, might be recoverable under New Jersey law governing implied loan terms. The answer, which she read in the email, was nuanced. The $7,000 with no written agreement would be difficult to recover as a loan since there was no documentation of repayment terms. However, if she could demonstrate that the transfer had been made under undue influence, and Ashley Park noted that the pattern of documented requests from Cassie over that period, which Nora had provided from her email archive, was suggestive, there might be grounds to recharacterize it. This was not the most important piece of the case. The most important piece, Ashley Park had identified in a separate analysis Nora hadn't asked for, but which the associate had generated on her own initiative, which Nora took as a good sign about Ashley Park's instincts. The identity theft, when it occurred, would be a federal matter under 18 U.S.C. Section 1028, with civil remedies including actual damages, attorney's fees, and punitive damages in some jurisdictions. But the cards hadn't been opened. The freeze was in place. Nora read this and thought, it won't happen. The architecture worked. She felt the particular satisfaction of a problem that had been solved at the structural level, not addressed after the fact, not managed once the damage was done, but prevented by building the right conditions before the first vulnerability was exploited. This was what Victor Ching had spent 20 years trying to teach young analysts. Prevention is always cheaper than remediation. Build the controls. She'd built the controls. She had one more email to send before she left the cafe. She wrote to Rebecca Lau at Whitmore and Lau and asked for a quarterly review of the trust and a specific annual check to ensure no one was attempting to bring action against the property on any other grounds. Mechanics liens, tax issues, neighbor disputes. She wanted eyes on it. Permanently. Rebecca replied within an hour. Understood. We'll set this up on a retainer basis. Nora accepted the retainer. She walked out of the internet cafe into the Cusco afternoon, where the altitude light was doing what altitude light does, flattening shadows, making the colonial facades of the Plaza de Armas look almost two-dimensional, like a stage set for a city rather than a city itself. She stood on the cobblestones and breathed the thin air and felt very specifically like herself. She sent Marco a message. Cusco is a stage set. The real thing is everywhere else. Oh, he replied, that's true of most famous places. She replied, where are you? He replied, heading to Lima next week, then home. She replied, me too. Home, I mean. He replied, same week? She replied, probably. He replied, Brooklyn? She replied, yes. He replied, then. One word, but clear. She landed at JFK on a Tuesday morning in late March, 5 months and 11 days after she'd left. The landing approach came in over Jamaica Bay, and she could see the grid of the outer boroughs below. Orderly. The gray, the pale green of early March lawns in the residential neighborhoods, the brown of the winter Hudson. It looked nothing like Torres del Paine or the Atacama or the Sacred Valley. It looked entirely like New York. She was glad to see it. Her storage unit's contents went back into her apartment, which she'd held through the extended absence by the simple expedient of continuing to pay rent. She unpacked the Gregory Baltoro in her bedroom and hung it on the hook behind the door. The waterproofing spray had done its job. The pack was clean and functional and had covered approximately 400 kilometers of trail. She made coffee. Not from gas station grounds, from the good beans. She called Victor Chung. "The Hargrove case," she said. "Closed 2 weeks after you left," he said. "We managed." "I know. I want to come back." "When?" 2 weeks. I need to sort some things here first." "What things?" "The ones I should have sorted before I left," she said. She met Cassie for lunch. This was her choice, made deliberately, because she understood, as she had not fully understood in the other timeline, that managed confrontation is more effective than avoidance. Avoidance allows the other party to build narrative in the space you've left. Managed confrontation sets the parameters. They met at a restaurant in Midtown, neutral territory, somewhere public enough that high emotion would be muted by context. Cassie arrived 5 minutes late, which was her invariable habit, and she looked, Nora observed with professional detachment, the way new mothers look at 6 months postpartum when they are managing but not sleeping, the specific careful assembly of a person who has allocated all available resources to function and has none left for surplus. She was also, Nora noted, beautiful in the way she'd always been beautiful. Cassie had the kind of face that processed difficulty as character rather than damage. "You look well," Cassie said. "You look," she seemed to be searching for the word. "Different. Rested," Nora said. "Is that what it is?" They ordered. The silence between the ordering and the food arriving had a texture to it, the specific quality of two people who have things to address and are deciding in real time how to begin. "The cabin," Cassie said. "The cabin is in a trust," Nora said. "I know you know this. I know you called a Stowe attorney." Cassie had the grace not to deny it. Derek thought, I know what Derek thought. He thought Grandma Eleanor's property was going to be available to your family because I've spent the past several years demonstrating that my assets are available to you without my informed consent." She said it without heat. "That's not an accusation of bad faith. It's an accurate description of a pattern." Cassie was quiet. "Mia is healthy," Nora said. "Yes." A flash of something genuine. She's remarkable." "I'd like to meet her." Cassie looked at her. There was something in that look that Nora recognized as a recalibration of the same order she'd been doing herself. The look of a person who is encountering a version of someone they thought they understood and discovering that the version they knew was not complete. "You're not angry," Cassie said. "Not a question. An observation." "I was," Nora said. "That passed." "Well, what I am now is clear." "Clear about what?" "About what my resources are for. About who has access to them and under what conditions." She picked up her water glass. "The cabin is mine. The trust protects it. I'm not going to lend you money without a written agreement in future if I lend it at all. Those are the parameters." She set the glass down. "Within those parameters, I'm your sister. I want to see Mia. I want to have lunches with you. I want, eventually, to go to Morristown and have a meal with Mom and Dad that is about being a family and not about what I can be asked to provide." Cassie looked at the table. "I know I've taken things from you," she said finally. "I know I've—" A pause. "I don't think I understood what I was doing." "I know," Nora said. It doesn't excuse it," Nora said. "But I believe it." She looked at Cassie directly. "The people I've prosecuted in fraud cases rarely understand the full moral weight of what they've done at the time they're doing it. They understand it after. That's why the legal framework exists. Not to punish understanding, but to establish limits that function regardless of understanding." Cassie stared at her. "You're comparing me to a fraud case." "I'm explaining the logic of why I have legal structures protecting my assets. Not as punishment, as architecture." She almost smiled. "It's not personal, Cassie. It's structural." The food arrived. They ate. Cassie told her about Mia, the first time she'd turned over, the way she reacted to music, the specific quality of exhaustion that was also, Cassie admitted, the most clarifying experience of her life. Nora listened. She took a photograph that Cassie showed her of Mia at 4 months. round-faced, alert, with an expression of intense concentration directed at something off-camera that Nora recognized, startlingly, and as a look she'd seen in her own reflection. "She looks like Grandma Eleanor," Nora said. Cassie looked at the photograph. "I thought that, too." They finished lunch. They hugged at the corner briefly, with the careful warmth of two people whose relationship is being rebuilt rather than restored, different from what it was. Not a return, but a new construction. Nora walked back toward the subway. She called Ashley Park. "I'm home. I want to schedule a review of the full file. The trust, the credit monitoring, the outstanding questions. Can you do Thursday?" "Absolutely," Ashley said. "Good. And Ashley, the work you've done on this has been excellent. I'm going to retain you personally for ongoing monitoring." A pause. "Thank you, Miss Vance." "Nora," she said. She met Marco for coffee on a Thursday afternoon in Brooklyn, at a small cafe in Boerum Hill that had the specific character of places that have existed in a neighborhood long enough to be a landmark without anyone having officially decided they were one. Worn wood counters, a complicated espresso machine, a chalkboard menu that changed seasonally. He was there before her. He had a coffee already. He was looking at photographs on his camera screen with the concentrated focus she recognized now as simply how he operated when left to his own devices. He looked up when she came in with the same efficiency, registered her, filed her, and the focused concentration became something else. "The salt flat photograph," she said, sitting down. "Has it made it into the project?" "It's a possible sequence ending," he said. "The salt flat image, then the mine at dawn, then the glacier calving. Lag across systems." He turned the camera toward her. The screen showed a rough sequence. 3 images side by side. The frozen saltwater reflection. So the mine entrance in the thin Bolivian dawn. The gray glacier face. "The mine is the human layer," she said. "Yes. Then you need something in the sequence where the human and the environment are in the same frame." He looked at her. "Not illustratively," she said. "As data. The miner's face in direct sun, eyes closed. That one. Where is that in the sequence?" He pulled up the photograph on the screen. It was the one he'd sent her from Potosi, a man in his 40s, so face weathered to the specific texture of very old leather, in direct afternoon sun with his eyes closed in what might have been sleep, or might have been simply the momentary closing of eyes against light. "Before the glacier," she said. "After the salt flat. The human lag, between the mine work and the ice loss, needs to be in the center." He looked at the sequence for a long time. "Yes," he said. She ordered coffee. The afternoon light came through the cafe's single large window at the angle that afternoon light takes in March in New York, low, slightly golden, with the quality of a season that hasn't fully committed yet. She thought about the Torres del Paine at sunrise, the specific color she'd never had a name for. "I have a name for it now," she said. He looked at her. "The color of the towers at sunrise. I've been thinking about it since October. It's the color of something on the verge of transparency, the moment before backlit ice becomes fully transparent. That liminal quality." "Threshold light," he said. She looked at him. "That's what I call it," he said. "In the project notes. The moment when a system is on the edge of becoming what it's going to be." She was quiet. "That's exactly it," she said. The coffee arrived. The afternoon light moved a few degrees toward the window frame. She thought about her grandmother's cabin in Vermont, 17 acres, a property in trust, the assessed value and the title clear, and the legal architecture around it solid. She thought about the trail account she'd started again, already, because she was going back next year, farther this time, and the year after that farther still, because she'd learned something irreversible about what her attention was for and who deserved to benefit from it. She thought about the truck on Route 9. She thought, not this time. "Tell me about the next phase of the project," she said. He told her. "Iceland," he said, "the retreating glaciers there, which move faster than the Patagonian ones, which make the lag more visible." He wanted to be there in late summer when the melt rate was at its peak. He wanted to film the specific color of glacial meltwater in Icelandic light, which he described as categorically different from the Southern Hemisphere light, colder, more lateral, but more unforgiving about what it revealed. She listened. She thought, Iceland in late summer. She thought, the trail account has 8 months. She said, tell me more about the light. She went back to Calloway and Marsh on a Monday. Victor Cheng's office was where it had always been, at the end of the hall with the window that faced north, and never had good light, which he'd always said suited him because he didn't trust good light. His desk had the controlled chaos of a man who understood exactly where everything was, despite it looking disordered to anyone else. He looked at her for a moment when she walked in. You look different, he said. Rested, she said. Is that what it is? She sat down across from him. I want to talk about the senior examiner position. He raised an eyebrow. Webb's slot? Webb is leaving in June. Prius is moving to the Chicago office. That creates 2 openings at the senior level. She had checked this before she came in. She'd made a call to HR, framed as a routine inquiry. My case record before I left was the strongest in the department at the associate level. My leave was legally protected under FMLA. The failure to promote me twice prior to my leave, given my performance record, creates a potential adverse action claim under— Nora, Victor said. She stopped. He looked at her with the dry, some unhurried attention that had always been his principal characteristic. You don't need to file a claim, he said. You needed to ask. She blinked. You never asked, he said. You were exceptional at the work, and you were never aggressive about your own advancement, and I assumed, incorrectly it appears, that you were satisfied where you were. She looked at him. You're telling me it was never about the leave. The leave didn't help timing-wise, but no. He leaned back. You're being promoted to senior examiner effective May 1st. The paperwork is already being written. She stared at him. I was told you were coming back today, he said. Ashley Park told my assistant. She also told my assistant that you'd be ready to take the Bergman case, which is complex enough that I wasn't sure who to assign. What's the Bergman case? He slid a file across the desk. The top sheet said, Bergman Industries, suspected internal fraud, revenue recognition. She opened the file. She read the first 2 pages with the focused attention she gave to the beginning of anything with the potential to be interesting. Revenue recognition fraud had a specific shape. It was one of the most common and, when done with sophistication, one of the most difficult to trace because it required understanding not just the numbers, but the business logic underlying the numbers. She looked up. How long has this been running? We think 3 years minimum. Who's the forensic team? You, if you take it, 2 associates. She looked back at the file. She thought about the negative space in a system, the pattern where something should continue and doesn't. She thought about threshold light, the moment when a system is on the verge of becoming what it's going to be. I'll take it, she said. She stood up. She picked up the file. At the door, Victor said, Nora. She turned. The mountains, he said. Were they everything you expected? She thought about the towers at sunrise, the glacier in backlit conditions, the crack and the 2-second lag and the white explosion of ice into water. She thought about a man on a narrow trail looking at light through a lens and not looking at the path. More, she said. She walked out. 3 months later, she received a letter from Ashley Park's office containing the quarterly review of the Vermont Trust. The cabin assessed now at $347,000. A modest increase, no encumbrances, no legal challenges. Bernard Whitmore had been in contact with the Vermont property manager she'd hired, and everything was in good order. She filed the letter. She pulled up the trail account. The balance was $6,100, rebuilt from zero in 5 months. She had a savings target. She was on track. She was in the middle of the Bergman case, which was exactly as complex as she'd expected, and which had the specific shape of a fraud she'd seen variants of 3 times before. A CFO with a small number of trusted subordinates, pressure to hit quarterly targets, a gradual escalation of the revenue manipulation from one quarter to the next that had the character of a habit rather than a plan. The CFO was not a criminal mastermind. He was a man who had made one wrong decision under pressure and then made 600 subsequent decisions to prevent the first one from being discovered. This was, she had come to understand, how most frauds worked. It was also, she thought, how most self-deceptions worked. She put the quarterly review in the file. She went back to the Bergman ledgers. Marco texted her on a Friday evening. The message was, Iceland dates August 15th through September 20th. She set down the Bergman file. She pulled up the trail account. She did the math. She replied, I can be there August 18th. He replied, I'll be in Reykjavik the 18th. The glacier axis is a 2-day drive east. She replied, I know. He replied, You've researched it? She replied, I research everything. He replied, I know. She looked at the response on her screen for a moment. She thought about the hostile courtyard in the Atacama with the most improbable sky she'd ever seen. And the cold wind off the Andes arriving clean and undisturbed, and the specific quality of the moment between what she'd been and what she was becoming. Threshold light, the moment on the edge. She replied, The calving face, late afternoon light. He replied, 3 p.m. on, bring a 2000 shutter speed. She replied, I don't have a camera like that. He replied, I have 2. She put her phone down. She opened the Bergman file. She found the pattern she'd been looking for in the revenue data, a specific series of entries in the fourth quarter reporting from 2019 through 2022 that formed an absence, a gap in the sequence where the numbers should have continued and didn't. The shape of it was unmistakable once you knew where to look. She pulled the source documents. She began to mark them. Outside her office window, the Midtown afternoon was doing what Midtown afternoons do. The noise of it, the cabs and the construction and the distant sirens and the human density of 8 million people, all in proximity to each other, all moving in the intersecting currents of their own urgencies and their own losses and their own slow accumulations of everything they'd put off until later. She didn't look up. She had work to do.
Glenn, who I shouted out earlier, Glenn made the Hounds of Love album cover for me in, what's it called? Not perler bead. What are they called? The ones that you melt down. Little beads, little beady little bitches. Oh, pre-algorithm internet, the good old days. Perler? Are they perler? Is that what they're called? Let me just, I want to show you. This is Glenn right now. I'm streaming his stream. This is Glenn right now. Look at him go with his ironing board. Look at him go. I love him. The ones that you melt. Okay, I'm keeping this open and I'm gonna look. We're in ads. Bees? He'll make a great housewife someday. He absolutely will. Yeah. Wow, I can't wait. I didn't see it. So Glenn is making this for me and he's sending it to me. The iron down kind. Yeah, salesman. Yeah, the ones that you iron to like melt them down and combine them. Ads. Sorry. Okay, I can't wait to see. The ironing kind. Yeah. Is it perler? Is that what they're called? I'm dumb. Iron bees. If you're stuck in ads, I would love to know what ads you get. Yes. Yes. Mandy, yeah. Perler beads. Okay. Okay. I feel like I heard him mention that. And then I didn't know if I made that up or not. Okay. He did. Would you show me the Joshua Tree painting so I can show my teen? Yes. Hello, teen. This is the Joshua Tree painting. This is the Joshua Tree.